I'm really pleased to introduce Sabhanaz Rashid Diya, Executive Director of Tech Global Institute. Uh, Diya, if you don't know, has an incredibly vast and diverse experience, which she brings to the discussion today. Starting as a journalist in Dhaka, founding a global organization that mentored over 1 million in using tech to pilot public service innovations for emerging markets, and working on tech policy with the US DoD at the Gates Foundation, and then most recently as head of public policy for Bangladesh at Meta. I met Dia a year ago at a small conference, and I don't know if you remember, Dia, I introduced myself, and I think the first thing you said was, "Oh, Prosocial Design Network. Question: How much of the research that you aggregate is from the Global South?" And I thought, wow, this woman is amazing. She gets right to the point, which I love. And so let us get right to the point here and dive into our conversation. So welcome, Dia. And so, yeah, as you all know, we're here to talk about how the responsible tech field operates with the Western or even US-centric lens that's often blind to the values, concerns of folks in the global majority. So, Dia, start us off and share how you see the prevailing values embedded in responsible tech, and yeah, how you see them having a Western lens.
Yeah, thank you so much, Julia, for having me here, and thanks everyone for making the time. I know everybody's a very busy schedule. I'm excited to be here. I think in sort of if I have to go back a few, several decades perhaps, in sort of how we think about the internet today, it's in many ways a lot of researchers would call it sort of the four internets, right? You have your Silicon Valley innovation-friendly internet, then you have your DC kind of a very sort of markets-driven internet, and then you have your Chinese model, which is very much about sovereignty and kind of national sort of thinking around the internet. And then you have the more sort of it's been there for a while, but it's really governed in the last couple of years around sort of the European framework of internet as a collective compliance regime. Um, and so it's really interesting to kind of see these four internets evolve in the last 20 years, um, as and sort of these sort of values kind of driving how we think about safety, how we think about content design, how we think about product development. But in nowhere in that list do you see a global South country. I mean, China is technically a global South country, but it's a very unique part of that global South. But in nowhere we actually see that sort of conversation emerging. And I think if I kind of narrow it down to very much not just the internet as a whole, but really around social media and how platform design has been happening, so much of it has been a combination of the first two internet values, right? You have your Silicon Valley market driven, Silicon Valley innovation driven, which is, let's build as many products as possible, as fast as possible, and ship it to the world. And for those of you who are from industry, you would know the meaning of the word ship. It has a very specific product connotation to it. And then, or let the market decide how a product or a company should exist and should operate. And I think as sort of platforms spread across the world, they actually carried those values with them, right? They carried this value of let the market decide and let sort of innovation prevail. And so when we go to places, where we operate a lot, we see a lot of precedents being set by, for example, American case law. We see, for example, how people think about copyright, IP, data protection, privacy, how what speech should be allowed, what speech should not be allowed, very much driven by jurisprudence set by American case law. And so when these sort of decisions meet or get sort of in these other contexts with a very different set of values, then it becomes really difficult. Then you start seeing the distance, and you start seeing some of the challenges come up. So one concrete example is really on women's safety, which is where I spent a lot of time of many years ago, spent a lot of time. I think if you look at sort of the policies around nudity, for example, right, and how they have been shaped, and what is considered nude versus not nude, it's a very, very thriving debate, both in the U.S. and in Europe, particularly places like France. And so it's a very live conversation. But then you come to parts of, say, Asia And then there's a very wide debate on what would be considered nude, because even like for somebody to even not have even if they're not fully nude, if you, and there's a lot of like debates about nipples and everything, but even if it's not fully nude, I think even some partial level of nudity, or even this illusion of nudity itself, can be extremely dangerous for them, and it could actually get women killed if that kind of content is online. Then you go to places in Africa, for example, where there is a lot of pride around sort of the human body. There's a lot of sort of, where indigenous cultures, and then there's a lot, and then for example, that defies the European norms around nudity, for example, right? Because that you're able to show more skin. So this has been like one of those areas where predominantly that framework was implemented across the world, but in many ways it just completely fell apart when it went to different regions. I am not like, I mean, obviously we're going to go into design in a second, but I think like just starting from that policy framework, because that is in many ways the rules that decided how design should be, what should be, what should be down. I think we see a lot of that thought process kind of break down as it goes to other places. So I'll pause here for a sec. Sorry, you're on mute, Julia.
I muted myself to mute my dogs in the background, but they've settled down. I'm already receiving such an education. Thank you, Dia. And yeah, so and thanks for breaking down kind of like the four main paradigms. I don't know what we would call them, the four kind of regimes that exist. So can we, and thanks for that example also of specific case of nudity, how we might see policy differs across regions. So and you've spoken about U.S. How so much is embedded in U.S. case law, for example. But do you see that there are? Let's start with the European paradigm. So collective compliance regime, I think you called it, which we might in this space kind of consider the best option of the four that you labeled earlier. What would be you see the inherent values in that regime versus how they might not reflect values outside of Europe, for example?
Yeah, so I think I want to start also breaking down why we think it's the best of the lot right now, right? I mean, I think that it's worth kind of interrogating that, because part of it is because the first part in the first two models, which is the Silicon Valley and the DC models, have really failed to kind of address any of the safety concerns, right? And so I think Europe, and in many ways, I think Farzana made a really good point. It's also not homogenous, right? Because you have the fundamental difference between France and Germany in how they think about hate speech, right? There's very distinctive differences between East Europe versus West Europe. So there's a lot of breakdown even there. But if you just take EU as a block, and for as a starting point, just for the sake of this conversation, um, I think there is a lot of in terms of sort of European, I think a lot of it is grounded in the European sort of Council of European Council, European Commission, the European Court of Human Rights. So there's a lot of those grounding within that framework as well, that I think has dictated how sort of Europe or the EU specifically approaches looking into platform design and platform accountability. So one is that sort of the long sort of arc of history, but the other aspect of that is really thinking through, what does a sort of compliance regime that's tailored around, there's this transparency, but there's also a lot of sort of, how do we measure, how do we decide, sort of what percent is considered hate speech. And there's a lot of assessments, there's a lot of, I would say, like operational elements to it that I think is quite embedded within the within the EU framework of how they're thinking about design. Whereas a lot of what we're seeing, which is so from a normative perspective, it's a bit around European Court of Human Rights and some of the precedents set by Europe. There's a lot of it is also driven very much through thinking through immigration. I think that's one very sort of important pillar. A lot of it is driven through thinking through national security, both as EU as a collective, but also EU against Russia, EU against China. So we see a lot of that, a lot of how people think about sort of technology governance in that space, driven by those kind of value systems. And of course, sovereignty is a more recent one, but EU has thought about sovereignty for a very long time. So we see those as the predominant value architectures driving how legislations and safety design, or not safety design, I would say, the compliance regime around safety is being developed in that particular part of the world. And then you go elsewhere, and I think a lot of those norms do not really exist. There's a lot of debates in my space where we talk about if we were to have DSA in other parts of the world, what would that look like? Would that actually work? Because objectively, this is seen to be as one of the most forward-leaning. It's like the best in class that we have right now. But then the question often that we kind of throw back is, sure, I think there's certain elements of it that make sense, but the DSA has things around having sort of appointing sort of local counterparts. It requires certain kinds of access to data, and so in a very different political context that does not have the might and the strength and the precedent set by the European Court of Human Rights, that would just not work. Those would actually be considered extremely repressive, extremely problematic, because in those political contexts, that will be very prone to abuse. And so, just fundamentally, that sort of what we call sort of the Brussels effect, if you take it as sort of verbatim, it just doesn't fundamentally work. So there's that. I think that's kind of where we see some of that tension kind of crop up. And as far as the value systems are concerned, I think also in different parts of the world, and again, I want to be very clear that there's a lot of diversity there. It's not a monolith. It's not just, it's not a single entity. But there are value systems that are driven by, for example, indigenous cultures. So there's a lot of value systems around stewardship. So we think about, for example, privacy through a very individual rights-centered approach. But then if you go to parts of the world, it's really about collective data governance and collective privacy, right? So how does that operate in that environment? Because that's not inherently a bad thing. But for the longest time, we've been told, it's about the individual versus the community. So how do we think about that? So that's like one example. Then you go to some other parts of the world, which it is very much about sort of individuals and that kind of privacy lens. In some places, it's the responsibility of the state. So the state is seen as the steward for privacy, and the expectation is that the state is going to keep people protected, right? So there is a lot of tensions between how we think about the individual, the community, or the collective, and then the state in that scenario, and sort of who is the steward for safety, whose responsibility is it, whose rights are we protecting, and who is supposed to be sort of the ultimate sort of rights holder in that context, right? And I think there's a lot of things that fall apart as we bring sort of the European model elsewhere.
I feel like we are only going to scratch just the infinitesimal part of the surface in this conversation. And I want to open it up for questions in a moment, but just let's, one last. So you've done a really great job of describing the different values, the different tensions. What would be the ideal way to kind of resolve these tensions? Like, how would you set up kind of I'm assuming there's not going to be some kind of global standard or a global regime, but at what level, I'm assuming, would you kind of break it down in order to, so that.
Yeah, I think so. I think there's a couple of elements to that, right? So one thing is that I think when we think about platforms generally, there's this belief that platforms have to scale and they have to be global. And a lot of it's tied to operating costs. But then you look at what's happening in the US and the EU, and then you see what's happening in India. Those are fundamentally very different compliance regimes. And platforms are compliant in all three regimes, right? So this idea that in order for us to operationalize these interventions, we have to keep costs down, therefore we must have a homogeneous policy line across the world. I think that fundamentally should be interrogated, because we don't really see that in different parts of the world. So that perhaps operating costs aren't as high or as impossible as one may want to believe. So I think that's one starting point. The second is, I think, in terms of definitions, I think there's been really excellent work done by DTSP on that front in terms of how we define these various categories of harm. There's what has been done by GIFCT. There's a lot of different groups that have been really thinking through in very specific areas of work how we define harm, and what would constitute harm. And I think in those kinds of conversations, we very rarely see global majority participation. So I think if there's an opportunity to actually bring some of the communities in that conversation at the very definition level, forget about design and enforcement and scale and governance, at very much the definition level of what does harm look like? How do you define these various categories? I think that is a good place of sort of beginning to bring things a bit more aligned. And the third piece I'm going to say is just in terms of how we even think about communities. I think oftentimes when we think about the world, we think of it as geographies, but I think there's also quite a bit of quite a bit of thinking in terms of that we think a lot about in terms of there's perhaps a lot more in common between a middle class New Yorker who has like 4 kids living in the Bronx and sort of like a middle class person living in Indonesia in Jakarta, right? There's a lot of commonalities between them, so it's not necessarily about geography. So seeing geography as the singular unit of comparison, I think is quite limiting. I think we should see it as rather as geographies as communities which have shared value systems, right? And I think that gives us a more distinctive pockets of, I guess, value systems that we can then start thinking of how do we bring that at the definition level in a way that is able to accommodate this. But at the end of the day, I think one challenge that's always going to be the case is we'll unlikely ever get to a point where all values can be accommodated, right? That's kind of why the multilateral system is under so much strain all the time, because it's quite impossible to get there. But I do think we can get to a point where through those very deliberative co-creation processes, we minimize the amount of value divergence that happens. Because I think fundamentally we do all agree on some very basic principles. But then how do we slice it out? And then how do we get the communities together, I think is really critical.
All right, I already see questions in the chat, so I'm going to wrap up the video right now and we'll go to the Q&A.